Today is day 2 of what for some of you will be a full and very exciting week. I heard about some of your activities last night, good dinner, a little shopping for some of you, a little exploring for others. And, if the dean who talked to you yesterday, Andre Plourde, was excited to see, the sign over at the hockey game on Sunday night, I'm sure lots of people around campus will be looking at your very spiffy jackets and saying, wow, that's neat. Lucky you to get those jackets. This morning we have a number of presentations. We're going to begin by talking about citizenship with Elder Sarah Jerome. And then we're going to have a presentation by Larry Chartrand on citizenship and the idea of decolonizing citizenship. We were going to have a second presentation by Martin Papillon from the University of Montreal, but unfortunately he's had a family emergency and is not able to come, but we have got a plan. So don't worry, things will be happening. And what we want to do, and I'm going to tell you this now so you can sort of start rolling this around in your mind. You've been talking a lot, perhaps, about identity. You're here, many of you, as Gwich'in youth. You're here thinking about the future of Gwich'in territory, Gwich'in culture, your own lives. And so in the latter part of the morning, Francis Abel, who you met yesterday and who's been working very hard to put this event together, is going to facilitate a discussion around identity and citizenship. And we're going to talk about and ask you to reflect on your thinking about your own identity and how your thoughts about identity may factor into the way you think about yourself as a citizen, whatever kind of citizen you think you are. Okay? So that's just sort of a little taste of what's going to come later on in the morning. And we think that because of all of the active participation that occurred yesterday, all the questions and discussion, that we'll be able to have a really lively discussion among everyone who's here today. Just a couple of announcements. One, really. The mics are in stands, and yesterday we were passing the mic around, but some people had the mic and then others needed to talk, and so things sometimes got a little confused around who was on first, who was talking. So today we're going to ask that you come to the stand and ask your questions. As yesterday, you won't be on camera. The only on-camera person will be the person on the podium. Your voice will be heard, but you won't be on camera. So if you wouldn't mind just coming to the two places, and then either the speaker or myself as moderator will direct traffic in terms of who asks the question next. Okay? Before we proceed, are there any questions of, what's going to happen next? Where is what? That anyone has? I don't know if you're getting out on campus at all yet, but I know you will before the week is over. The bathrooms are to the left of the living wall, the wall with the plants on. There's a corridor, and if you go down that corridor, the bathrooms are on the left, as is a water fountain, but there's water, I believe, outside as well this morning, and snacks. So don't worry, you will be fed again today, and if you get hungry or thirsty, just go and get a snack or a drink. Okay, let's begin, and we are going to begin this morning. We are honored to have in our presence Sarah Jerome, a Gwich'in elder, and she is going to proceed with a Gwich'in citizenship testimonial. So Sarah.
Ban Gwich'in Chartrand chicken no what a kisha. The J Gaona Tanjik was a neat and no chill. Chicken chick go and not chat at fact a chicken chick go here. Not none the chan touch couldn't die. I wish it seconds Kahuna go and I'll chat at and don't and a chicken chick go here. Nanjita gonjo. Nuri the Bashi. Nuri the Bashi. Ban Quincy. Show Inly. This is what it was like for us when we walked into the residential school. For me, it was in 1955 when I went to All Saints Slavic School. I walked into the classroom, into All Saints School. All I heard was English. I didn't know a word of English, but that's getting ahead of my story. Slide. This is where it all began. It's on the Peel River that flows into the Mackenzie. How many of you know where the Mackenzie is? Good for you. The Peel River flows into the Mackenzie. And this is a place called Road River. It's right inside the NWT Yukon border. And this is where I was raised for the first 8 years of my life. Immersed in the language, the culture, the love, the sharing, the hugs. Everything I did, I was praised. Anything I learned, I was encouraged to learn more. This is where it happened. The winter and fall camp, just across the river from there was the spring camp. And 3 kilometers up was our summer camp. And that's where our parents raised us. I was in balance. How many of you are in balance? Physically, mentally, spiritually, psychologically, 100%. That's where I came from at the age of 8. When I walked into that residential school, I was a failure already because I didn't understand English. I was punished because I didn't understand English. I didn't like the food. I didn't like the smell of the place. They took all my clothes away from me. They gave me clothing that smelled different. It was what you would call today traumatic. And that wasn't the only trauma we experienced. The trauma of different foods, the trauma of rules, the trauma of being in a little box, couldn't get out. Oh, there was times when I wanted to cry, and I couldn't cry. I shut down. The seasonal camps happened there, spring, summer, winter, fall. Summers were the best, because for 12 years I was in residential school. Every summer, my mom and dad would take us back up there. Thank God my mother never spoke English. Thank God she knew all her skills. She taught us everything. She taught us teamwork. She taught us how to forgive and to get on with our life. We had a lot of forgiving to do. But again, I'm getting to the head of my story. My parents had 14 children, 12 surviving. 2 died in infancy. So there were 12 of us, and every one of us was taken away one by one. There she is, and now you know why I'm dressed the way I do today. I paid tribute to Mama Bella Charlie, and I have to. Because, you know, when I did a presentation to teachers one year in Inuvik, I had the same outfit on. I said, "Isn't she beautiful?" My mother never spoke English, but she taught us all the traditional skills. During my 12 years, I became ashamed of who I was. I was ashamed of my parents, ashamed of the kind of life they lived. Because at the residential school, we showered, we had everything according to schedule. That day when I gave my presentation, all of a sudden I said, "Sorry, Mom and Dad. I asked for your forgiveness for being ashamed of you." So I made my peace with them. My mom and dad, my first teachers, the best teachers. Because you know what my dad said? Forgive and forget. That was ingrained in our lives. She taught us everything she could on the land. And my dad taught us to pray. To pray. And that was one of the AA members said to me, "Oh, by the way, 42 years sober this year." Alcohol and drugs affected our life, but it wasn't for nothing. I urge all of you to buy this book. Thank goodness for Rupert Ross, who worked as a prosecutor here in Ontario for many years. He finally found out when he retired why so many of our people were silent. And our people are silent because our voices were taken away. We were robots. We had no feelings. We couldn't cry. All because of the residential school. I'll get into that. Slide, please. John A. Tutlici went to Hay River for 3 years. 3 straight years, never came home. He lived to be 66. He was the first Dene Aboriginal person to be appointed to the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories. What a wonderful father. He mentored me from a very young age. I remember coming home from residential school and we were having a feast. And I'm sitting there beside my mom and he says, "Sarah, I want you to get up and interpret what I'm going to say in Gwich'in." And I'm sitting there shaking, look at my mother, hoping she would say, "Oh, don't let her do that." But she didn't even look at me. So I had to get up. He knew I had the leadership skills. But you know what? At residential school, if I spoke up, I was a troublemaker. Troublemaker. But I had leadership skills. Isn't that wonderful? We need that. He taught me. He taught me to stand up and speak. He introduced me to the rest of the Legislative Assembly members. He got me to travel with him. I was so shy. I'd walk downtown in Fort McPherson. I couldn't look at anybody. My head was down. If I saw somebody coming, I'd say, "Please don't say hello to me." That's how shy I was. Anyways, he became the chief of Fort McPherson. And he really questioned the Legislative Assembly members. Some of them were lawyers from across Canada. Hugh H. Campbell from Ottawa. There was Lloyd, somebody from Saskatchewan. Another professor at the University of Saskatchewan are all sitting at the ledge, and he used to get them stumped with his questions. But a wonderful father that taught us so much to share, care, love, forgive. Next slide, please. She was the one that passed at 106. My mom's mother. And this was the spring I was married, 1974. Mom died in January. I got married in April. November 11th, I quit drinking. December, I quit smoking. So can you imagine what my poor body went through? Mentally, I hadn't even recognized what had happened to me. Physically, I was trying to get rid of the alcohol. I was going through withdrawals big time. Thank God that I was able to sober up cold turkey. He wanted to educate his children, 12 of them, my late dad. So he made sure all of us went to school. I went to University of Saskatchewan in 72, 73. And I had received a letter in April of that year, and it says, please take a year off, because I had failed all my courses. I was partying. I was having a good time, I thought. So I went away feeling I was a failure. I'm not university material. I'm not going back there. And so my inferiority complex just went all around me. I had no self-confidence. I was fat, I was ugly, I was all the negative things you could think of. Not once did anybody come up and say to me, oh my God, are you ever beautiful? You're good looking. You've got a beautiful body. Nobody ever said that to me. I left that residential school as a robot. No feelings, no voice. Couldn't cry. Couldn't give compliments. I couldn't even hug anybody. Never mind saying I love you. I couldn't love anybody. I couldn't trust anybody because of what happened in the residential school. In 1984, I had my youngest son. I have 5 children, and I have 12 grandchildren. My oldest grandson is 18, and the youngest are twin girls, and they're going to turn 1 next month. But when I was having my youngest son, I had him in July, April of that year. I woke up one morning. I came staggering down the stairs in my log house, and I was wondering what was going on. Here I had lost my hearing in my left ear. When I went to the health center, the doctor said, oh, that's common, it'll come back. A year later, I was finally sent to Edmonton to get it checked out, and there was nothing they could do. But life goes on. From that moment on, I thought, oh, and I went to the health center, the nurse said, the doctor says you're going to eventually lose your hearing in your other ear. And I said, no way. No way. I said, I have things to do. I have to go back to school. I got to teach the language. And I walked away from there and I thought, no, people don't have to know I'm hearing impaired. I don't want them to feel sorry for me. And I just got on with my life. My grandfather, on my dad's side, next slide please. My grandfather is on the far right with his wife Alice, never did meet her. But my grandfather Alfred Treaties was deaf. He was hearing impaired. And I always remember wherever he was, people had to yell into his ears for him to hear what was being said. So I had an uncle who came to me when I lost my hearing. And he asked me if I did lose my hearing, and I said, yes. Somebody has to take after Gigi, I said. And my sense of humor kept me going. Our sense of humor kept us going in the residential school. Even though we were forbidden to speak our language, we still did it behind closed doors. We still did it out on the playground. Anyway, hearing impaired, I finally had to get a hearing aid when I went back to the University of Saskatchewan in 1989. I went back with 4 of my children, ages 3, 8, 10, and 12. My husband decided to stay up north so he could make extra money for us. So he did. Anyways, that was 14 years after I was asked to leave the university. And my perspective at that time was, I'm going to go back to university. And if I fail, so be it. So be it. Just means that I'm not university material. But if I pass, more power to me, eh? So I went with that perspective. And I did pass. I got my B.Ed. But you know, there's challenges all the time. I was doing my intercession course. I had just finished, and I had one more course to do in July to get my Bachelor of Education. And so when I finished intercession on Friday, we took the kids out in Saskatoon, took them out on the bus, did some shopping. We were going to take them back to Edmonton, and my husband was going to go back up north with them. Meanwhile, I was going to head back to University of Saskatchewan to do my last course. We get home that night, we got a phone call. My youngest brother had committed suicide. And I said to myself, these are the challenges we face. These are the obstacles that come up when we're trying to do something for ourselves. So I went home. We put my brother to rest, and then I went back to summer school to get my last course. I got it. I got it. I spent 2 years in a Clavic, All Saints School. And when I think back to my residential school years, those 2 years are the ones that always come back. Because we left the end of August, never came home till the end of June. Never saw my mom and dad, never saw my grandparents. Remember that beautiful setting at Road River where I was surrounded by the language, the culture, walking on snowshoes with my grandmother to check snares, you know, setting traps with my mom. I even had a dog team. Before the age of 8, I had a dog team. And you know, I considered that a PhD, according to our standards, because I knew everything about survival on the land. But when I got into the residential school, all I saw was red X's telling me I was a failure. You're wrong. You're not right. You're an Indian. We're going to erase that out of you. So that was the start of my anger, my resentment, my hatred towards a dominant society that came in as our supervisors, as our teachers. Mind you, there were a few good ones in there that really inspired us. I have another book in that bag there. And I talk about not having any emotions at all. Rupert Ross, Indigenous Healing, on page 132. You know, when I started reading this book, it's about Aboriginal people, First Nations across Canada, and specifically in Ontario. The way he wrote this book what really touched my heart, because our people, a lot of our people have not even started their healing. For some people, that truth and conciliation, the TRC, opened a can of worms for some of our people. Some of our people said, no way, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to go back there. It's too painful. They won't even touch it with a 10-foot pole. But you know, I was the principal of Chief Julia's School in Fort McPherson, and one of our leaders came down here for treatment at Bellwood, and a guy, I don't know if any of you know him, but Doug Smith will ever be engraved in my mind. Doug Smith, a psychologist, came up to Tronte Healing and started working with us, with families, with leaders. And Oh, was he brutal? Was he ever brutal? He just got us to deal with every issue we had in our life. He said, we're not here to deal with the drugs and alcohol. He said, we're here to deal with your history and residential school. And that's what we did. But I went there and I thought, no way am I ever going to break down with that guy. He's not going to make me cry. That's the attitude I went in with because I was so controlling, so angry. Anyways, we get in there, and as soon as Doc Smith sat across from you, you knew it was your day. So that day when Doc walked in, I looked across, I thought, oh no. The first question he asked me, he had me in tears. He had me in tears, not even 3 minutes, he had me in tears. And here I'm saying that I don't cry. But I was ready. I was ready to deal with that residential school and what it did to me. I wanted to get rid of that anger and resentment and prejudice that I had against this non-dominant staff, non-Aboriginal staff that came to work for me because after all I was a principal, and I had to be a model. So I had to become colorblind. Like right now. And he helped me. He gave me all the tools to help me to realize that it wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. It was the church and the people that they hired. It was way back then. You people here some of you don't even know anything about the residential school. You see homeless people across Canada on skid rows. And I've always said that's what the media likes to focus on. Is the people that are drunk, on drugs, homeless. They don't focus on these young folks here. Some of them are going to university. Some of them are in high school. They don't focus on our successes. Drunken Indian, that's what they focus on. But we're not all drunks. There are some of us that are very healthy, that have worked all our lives to try to heal our community, to help our people, to make them realize what happened to them. And I just wanted to read this. These are some of the people that Rupert had talked to, and these are the comments. We weren't allowed to cry because we were taught that way. It was really, really hard to cry or even laugh. When we look at Aboriginal people, because of their history, it is like they don't talk about their feelings. We can't. It was too painful. I have a brother. A couple of years ago, he said, I was a happy drunk for 40 years. Not once during that time did me or my peer groups ever talk about the residential school. My brother's been sober since 1992 now and working as a support worker for residential schools today. I had built this wall around me all over ever since I was small. I wouldn't allow anybody into that space of mine. I think it was really hard to take that risk and letting that down and letting people in. It got so bad, my friends, that when I met my husband, my dear loving husband who has supported me 100% and supported everything I did, when we met, he finally rehearsed how he was going to propose to me. And he did. He asked me to marry him. You know what I said? For how long? He said, till we're 60. I said, okay. And I visualized people, all of you, if you men had proposed, knelt down and offered the ring to your fiancé, happy occasion, I mean, all I said was, okay, and walked away, not even a hug. I didn't know how. I didn't want to get too close to another individual. I didn't want to get hurt again. It's very hard for me to say I love you to my husband. I say it to my children, my grandchildren, but not to my husband. Because my husband went through the residential school. He went through all that abuse. And he doesn't know how to talk. I talk to him. Okay, do what you have to do. You know, so I do. I had always shielded myself from other things that had happened. So for me, that was one of the biggest things, letting go of that shield. Not a shield, it was an armor so thick. Nobody could get in. A lot of times I might be having a feeling and not really know where it came from. Something present may have triggered in my life. But when I look back, it was, you know, a mood swirl, a lot deeper. So starting to really look and find the first time that pain was planted and was buried. And we buried that pain. We buried those emotions. And that wall was there. So when Doug Smith came up to Drondy, I said, and it was just about that time that the Berlin Wall was coming down. People were chopping away at the Berlin Wall. And I said to Doug, oh my God, what a coincidence, eh? Here you're trying to chop away at the Gwich'in walls that we have up here, you know? And it was a lot of work. It was very painful work, very painful. Anyways, I went to residential school to Aklavik for 2 years. I went to Fort McPherson for 6 years in residential school. In Inuvik High School for 4 years. 12 years of my life, I was in residential school. They really trained me well. Really. But you know what? When you're in there from a very young age, you get to read attitudes. You get to read body language, tone of voice. And so throughout my work, when a new teacher walked in, I would look at that person and think, oh yeah, I'll be able to work with Derek. Comes right into the gym, take inventory of all the gym equipment, started working. But when Doug came in that day to work with us, and we started talking, Derek sat there and he cried and he cried and he cried. And I went up to him and I said, what's the matter, Derek? He said, high school was the best time of my life. I didn't know all you people went through this. I said, well, now you know. Take that message with you and start educating your counterparts across Canada. Because we need your help, every one of you in here that don't know about the residential school. Thank you. I don't know your name, but what you shared with me yesterday touched my heart. I've never ever heard anybody say that before. Thank you. You're going to help us. Anyways, 12 years in the residential school. I was going to graduate next year, and I went home for Christmas. And we were at a feast and dance, and my dad was a chief. And he had gotten all this caribou up at Road River for the New Year's feast. So we were at the dance, and he said, I'd like to ask some of the boys to go up to Road River and pick up this meat, because the men usually do the New Year's feast. We do the Boxing Day feast, the women. But when the men do the New Year's feast, we do the cooking. That's just the way it is. Anyways, my sister and I were going to go up. I said, let's go up to Road River and get that meat. And she said, you, having been in residential school all these years, going to drive a dog team? I said, oh yeah, I am. And so I went with her. I had a dog team of 5. We went up. We camped on the way to Road River, and the next day we got there about 2 in the afternoon. And I go to that door, and I'm feeling around inside the door, and my sister says, Sarah, what are you doing? I said, I'm looking for the light switch. 50 miles outside of town, I'm looking for a light switch in a cabin. Oh, she was not happy with me, but that's what the residential school did to us. Anyways, 1974, 73 was when I went home, and I decided now is the time to spend time with my mom and dad and relearn all the traditional way, relearn because I already knew it. So I had to go home and relearn it. So I went back to Road River. Things were not the same. My mom wasn't getting up in the daytime, and she wasn't doing the things that she normally does. Somebody brought in a moose, it sat there, and I'm wondering what's going on. There was a Shell oil camp just above the river. They came down with a chopper and they picked her up. I had just gone into Inuvik before that too, and so when I heard Mom was in the hospital, I went up there. I walked into the hospital and her bed was there. And I was standing at the foot of the bed. And she says, excuse me, I'm going to be going to Edmonton for further tests to find out what's going on with me. The doctors didn't know what was going on. And mind you, 12 of her children were taken away, right, from in the mid-1940s right up to the 60s. 12 of her children were every year taken away. I walk in and she says, I'm going to Edmonton. I said, oh, Mom, I said, you're going to be home for Christmas. And she said, I don't think so. I don't think so. I so wanted to hug my mom. I so wanted to go and say, I love you, Mom. Give her a hug. But I didn't know how. I never had that contact. So I just stood there. The next time I saw my mom, they brought her home in a coffin in January. Today, I learned to hug the elders. I learned to hug the mothers and the fathers. Learning to say, I love you. Because we couldn't love anybody. How could you love somebody after 12 years in that institution? So Mom left us. But she left a lot of her teachings with us. She left so much. When I started relearning my language, I could hear her. I could hear her pronounce those words. My dad, same thing. So when I decided to go back to university in 1987, I did it because I was sitting on the District Education Authority, and I kept talking about it. I was doing community reports in my language on CBC, and it just seemed like nobody heard me. So I thought, okay, Freddie, I'm going back to university. I said to him, and he said, no problem, go. So away I went. People were watching me. There were other women that were watching me, waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to come home and say I gave up. I got on the plane in Inuvik with 4 of my children. My youngest was 3. And we landed in Norman Wells. We took off to Yellowknife. And he turned to me, he said, Mom, when we're going to go back and see Dad? And I looked at him and I was ready to cry. I said, Jimmy, don't ever say that again. I said, we're going to be in Saskatoon all year, and your dad's going to stay behind. We'll pray for him. We'll pray for him. Okay, he said. That was the first and last time he ever said that about his dad. Thank God. So I went back. People were watching me. I knew that, so I really had to work hard. when I graduated, I was in a Native Studies class, and the professor said, I would like you to do a paper on someone that really inspired you in your life. And Granny Annie G. Robert had just passed away in January of '87. And I had gone back to school in September. So I thought, oh my God, time for me to come to terms with my granny's death. So I went into the library. I had 2 classes on the Thursday. I went in between the 2 classes. I couldn't write fast enough. These thoughts were just coming. I was writing as fast as I could. The next class came, so I went to that. After that finished, I went back into the library and I kept writing. And I wrote a 10-page story of Granny. And it's called Writing the Circle. And it was published in there. It's called Granny. And I wrote a story of my grandmother, Juju Annie G. Robert, and what she did for our family. Just powerful. Anyways, I submitted the paper, and Professor Jolly said, Sarah, would you read this at our next class? I said, no way. No, I'm not going to do it. She said, why? I said, because as soon, even when I read it now, I said, I'm in tears. I'm in tears. She said, is it okay if I read it? I said, please read it. So there must have been about 75 people in that class, all walks. She started reading that story. You could hear a pin drop. Half, if more than half of that class was in tears. And when she finished reading it, she never said a word. She just stood there. Slowly, people started getting up and walking out. Not a comment from anybody. Everybody walked out. It was just too powerful. And years later, when I still read it, I get very emotional because Juju Annie had such a big influence on my life. I became the principal of Chief Julius when I graduated. Well, actually, I taught for a while, but because of my hearing, I had to step down as a teacher, and I applied as a principalship. So I got that in January of 1993. And then I moved to Aklavik for a year. Then the assistant director position came up in Inuvik. My friend Pauline Gordon was the director or superintendent. And she phoned me and said, Sarah, would you apply for that job? I said, are you kidding? I'll never ever be able to do the job as good as you. She said, you'll never do the job as good as me, but you'll do it the best that Sir Jerome can do it. My application went in right then and there, and I was successful. I worked in that capacity for 10 years. Very good experience for me. I met a lot of people. I learned to forgive. I learned to forget. Became really good friends with some of the staff. So I'm doing presentations to school staff. I do presentations to school staff in Yellowknife, in Inuvik. And my family have never heard me do this presentation. My daughter was there, my sister, one of my very good friends. And they were sitting right in the front row when I talked about my mom not being able to say goodbye. And all of them, that whole room was not a dry eye in that gym. My daughter never ever made a comment to me about that presentation. You see what I mean? Intergenerational effects. Our kids can't even talk to us sometimes about these things. It's so painful. When I started hugging my kids, I said to them, when we're together, we need to hug each other and say we love each other. But what if we're in a public setting? What if we're out in the public, I'm at a dance and I look at you and I want to know if you're doing okay, if you love me, how could we show? And they said, Mom, we'll wink at each other. So that's what we did. We had to work on it. You know, 1974, I sobered up. 1985, I finally went for healing. But jeepers sakes, I forgot. I was going to have Jimmy. I was pregnant. And I came across a book by Dr. Dyer. How many of you are familiar with Dr. Dyer? He does a lot of talks on TV about healing, about changing your life. Anyways, I'm okay, you're okay. That was the title of his book, and I happened to get a copy of that book, and I started reading it. And I got up one morning, and I thought, I don't really give a hoot what anybody thinks. I'm okay. And that was a big statement for me. Because remember, I was fat, I was ugly, I was all those negative things, eh? Boy, did I ever feel good. It just seemed like a whole load had lifted off me. And that's when I started talking about going back to school. Because finally I had confidence in me and who I was. I was beautiful, even though nobody told me. And even when my husband said that to me, I used to just shrug it off. I couldn't accept compliments. It just wasn't something that we were accustomed to. So anyways, I apologized to my mom and dad. And when I did that, it was for all the parents of a residential school. Anyways, I always used to wonder about the parents. How did our parents feel when all of a sudden, the end of August, all these kids would disappear? So I went to my sister-in-law one day and I said, how do you think our parents felt? It was really a coincidence that I should ask her. Because she said, you know what? I wanted to find out. So one weekend, she said, I decided to go home and ask my dad. There must have been some sort of communication going on. Our drive from Inuvik to Fort McPherson is about 2 hours. She gets home, goes in the door. Dad, she saw her dad sitting on a couch. Dad, why? She said to him. That's all she said. He started crying. She started crying. They both cried and cried and cried. And then the father said, you don't know. You don't know what we went through when our kids were taken away. I went out in the bush. After they took you away, I went out in the bush. I yelled and I screamed my head off. I couldn't do anything else. That's when I found out. When I was going to spend that year with my mom at Road River, I was sitting on that bench on the river bank. I said to her, after all the kids had gone back to school, I said, Mom, how did you do it? How? You've got 12 of your kids were taken away. And she said, I had no choice. I had no choice. And 6 of us girls, then there was a boy. And my brother was just the apple of my mom's eye. 6 of us girls. So we were treated like boys. We went out and cut logs with my dad. We got wood with him. Shell oil was in the vicinity. They needed these 45-gallon barrels taken up the river. So there was me and my dad rolling these 45s in a boat. So if you think I'm fragile, you see me out in the bush. 6 of us, girls. He treated us like boys, and we worked like boys. So when I have to dress up for an occasion, I really feel uncomfortable because I'm always used to working out on the land. Anyways, I finally retired in 2007 from my teaching, from the assistant superintendent, My sister had just battling cancer for 14 years, and just prior to her death, she said, Sarah, get out of that job. It's too stressful. You don't need that. So I said, okay, I'm out of here. So I retired. 2009, my daughter walked into me and said, Mom, there's a position out in Yellowknife. It's the Languages Commissioner of the Northwest Territories. I said, so? Oh, just thought I'd let you know, she said. So, of course, I put in my application, just to see what would happen. And I said, if I get an interview, that would be good. That will be more skills and more learning for me. So I did. So I was up the river doing on the land program with my husband with high school students, and just in March. And I get a call from the Legislative Assembly telling me to come down to Yellowknife for an interview. So I said, okay. So they made arrangements for me. And if I'm correct on this, anytime they hire contractors to work for them, the government, they invite them in, they give them time to check into the hotel, freshen up, maybe a day or so they're doing their interview. I remember this lady said, get to the airport, bring your luggage right to the ledge. I said, why? Because you're having your interview right then and there. And I thought, oh my God, I don't even have time to change or put on my makeup or whatever, but I go over there. Speaker of the House, the clerk of the council, and 3 other members were there, all men. I walk in and I said, where's the woman rep? And they said, what you talking about? I said, you guys are ganging up on me. I said, there's supposed to be a woman present here. And they started laughing. But I sat down. I made myself feel comfortable by saying that. So we went into the interview, and I went through my language act. I highlighted everything. I tried to memorize. Not one question from that language act. It was very informal. I was really surprised. And I just felt like, jeepers, if I get this job, it just seems like I didn't deserve it because they didn't refer to the Language Act. But anyways, they're talking and they're asking me questions. And then the clerk of the council said, Sarah, if you're successful, would you move to Yellowknife? And I looked at him and I said, if I'm successful at this job, I'm not moving to Yellowknife. I got a house to maintain in Inuvik. I don't have monies to rent a place or whatever. And so he looks at the speaker and he says, well, Mr. Delory, should we move the office to Inuvik? I knew I had the job. Right then and there. So they moved the office to Inuvik. And I worked out at the Capital Suites for 4 years. Traveled all over, learned so much, did a lot of ads in the 9 Aboriginal languages, plus English and French. So it was a good 4 years. Anyways, two people, well, actually my grandparents really inspired me. My dad really believed in education. He had only grade 3. So he really encouraged all of us to get out there and get our education and work for our people. But back in the 60s, there was a principal that came to Fort McPherson. He was from Newfoundland. O.G. Tucker, the love of our life. He just got right out there. He got in the community. He had a big loudspeaker on top of his house, and he would play music for us. Had us singing until we lifted the roof off the school. Just a wonderful guy. He believed in us. He was one of the first educators who made me believe in me and inspired me that I could do anything I wanted to do. And when I graduated from Stringer Hall, grade 12, there was a matron there that I went to her and I said, could you sign my yearbook? And what I read in there was, here's to a college degree and all the prestige that goes with it. Oh my God, can you just imagine what that did for me? That was in the files of my computer forever. And I knew I could do it. I thank those two people today because I have a B.Ed now. I have a Bachelor of Education. And I also have a PhD on the land skills. When I went to the Lonely Healing, back in balance, physically, mentally, spiritually, psychologically, I was healing. I was learning to get rid of that hate. And when I walked out of that school in Stringer Hall, I walked out with a rage. It wasn't hate, it was rage. I was ready to kill. And so many of our people do that today. You read it all the time in the news. It's because they don't know how to deal with that part of their life and to let go and to forgive. So next time you see a homeless person down there, First Nations, you'll understand where they're coming from. They don't know how to deal with it. They don't even know how to begin to heal. And if you say, leave it in the Creator's hands, they'll say, what Creator? They hired the staff to look after the RC school and Anglican school where the students were eventually fighting one another. Relatives were fighting each other. They don't have nothing to do with religion. But you know what we call it? Spirituality. Respect for the land, for the animals, for each other. That's how we're teaching it now in our Denic a Day curriculum, in our schools. So I quit blaming. I went to the TRC meeting in Vancouver, and there was a very distinguished elder that got up there, and she said, change your story. Change your story. Let go of that anger. Let go of that resentment. Change your story. And sometimes I get really carried away, like I did yesterday when I was talking about my friend MS Naidu. And I do that because so many of our people still don't have their voices. And I speak on behalf of them. I speak on behalf of my mom and dad, my Gigi Alfred and Stu Alice, Stu Annie G. Robert, who lived to be 106. They never knew what we went through. And you know, even though some of these students went home and said the priests and the nuns are abusing us sexually, physically, the parents said, don't say that about these people that are working for God. Only now I think they're finding out. And I used to wonder why all these good-looking boys never paid attention to me in high school. How come they don't even ask us to go for coffee? Because they were all sexually abused. And you try to go up and hug them, they're just rigid. That's a story of our life. That's where we came from. We're trying to heal. While I was sobering up, people were coming to me and wanting me to try to help them while I was still sick. When Doug Smith came up, he went to Nuvik, a Clavik, he came up to Fort McPherson and he said, oh, Sarah, he said, after what I heard in those two communities, I had to call my psychologist. You call your psychologist? I said to him, what about us? All those years that while we're healing, we're trying to heal our own people. Don't tell me about psychology. I was so upset at him. But look at how immense that hurt was. He knew, we called him the dangerous man, whenever he came along, oh, here comes that dangerous man, we better get out of here. Because every time he came around, he questioned us, and before we knew it, we were crying. We didn't want to cry. We never knew how to cry, so we didn't want anybody to see us cry. We were ashamed to cry. One year I never cried for 2 years, and I bragged about it. Now we have to start getting our emotions back. Start saying, I love you. You're not too bad, you know, you guys. All of you. You're all going to help us out. You're going to pass that message on for us. You're going to share it with people you work with, your students, your family. And let them know that we are on our healing path, as painful as it is. And we've lost a lot of our students that went away to residential school and never came home. My dad's uncle went down to Hay River. Nobody talked about it. My father died in 1983 with a massive heart attack out at our camp. My Uncle Johnny passed away with cancer. After that, that was 1997. After that, we found out that their uncle, who had gone to Hay River, ended up around Fort Resolution and married. And we had relatives down there. The Jeromes went to school with us in Cathedral Hall. And if one of us had even gone out with one of those boys, there we were going out with our cousins. We didn't know. But we found out. Very distinguished looking men that had laid cheese. Very distinguished. And people keep telling me that. You know, an elder said, even the way you walk shows how much pride you have in yourself. But being hearing impaired, one of the things I thought was, at least now I can identify with the elders, how they're feeling. But it's really frustrating because starting in September, my hearing started going down. So I'm talking to my little grandson. I can't hear what he's saying because my hearing gets very distorted some days. Jason, I can't hear you. So he comes right up to my ears and he whispers in my ear. So things like that happen that keep our humor up. We have to have our humor. It was the humor that kept us alive, that kept us resilient to survive and to talk about this today. When I was thinking about talking last night, I was just thinking to myself, oh my God, I don't want to cry. I don't want to cry. And just before I came in there, I said a prayer that I will tell my story positively and show that the residential school gave me an education. It gave me an education. It made me aware of the dominant society. And like old William Narsu said, you know, Sarah, he said, you have your one foot in both cultures. You speak English, you speak Gwich'in. You're more sophisticated than I am because he said, I only speak my Gwich'in language. I really took that as a compliment. My education now is being used to teach on the land skills, to teach a language, to help these young people here however way I can, to make them proud to be Gwich'in. Slide. And this is me after I finished the Drondy healing. 100%, physically, mentally, spiritually, psychologically, I was on my way to healing. And they told us to dress the way we felt or the way we wanted to be seen. That was me. 1992, my husband wanted to renew our vows. So I said, okay. I had a dress made, a belt, a headband. So I used that day to show that I was happily on my way to healing. And I hope that I have not offended any one of you in my presentation today. I hope that you will keep an open mind, take my story and feel free to share it. Feel free to use my name because I'm already covered. I'm protected. And I want people to know where I came from, that I survived 12 years. 12 years in the residential school. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, you have to write it down because I can't hear that well. Thank you. Thank you. My water.
Well, I think you have all just spoken, and the words that we've heard will stay with us for a very long time. And so on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Sarah. I've been hearing lots of comments about how amazing all of the content of this conference has been so far. So I think we have a very high level of energy, if I can put it that way, for a conference and discussions that are in their second day. I'd like to welcome our next contributor to those discussions, and that person is Professor Larry Chartrand, who is a faculty member in the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa. Larry has been with us for the past day and a half, and so is well aware of all that's been talked about so far. He's going to take us on the next step of our travels together by talking about rethinking citizenship from a decolonizing and international perspective. So Larry, do you want to come up, and we'll look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Gwich'in. I too want to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Algonquin people and their territory. And of course, I also want to acknowledge that today is International Women's Day as well. So, and I think we saw a shining example of what women can do today. So, if you haven't already thanked a woman, I'm going to go home after the conference and thank my wife for everything she's done and everything she's contributed to. And I recommend you do the same. It's a pleasure to be here and to have been invited. I do want to talk about citizenship, what that means, maybe how it relates to identity. I want to talk a bit about the potential incompatibility between Canadian citizenship and Gwich'in citizenship. And I'm focusing my presentation on the Gwich'in and using the Gwich'in land claim and the Gwich'in people as an example of some of the things I'm talking about. Just as an overview, though, it's important to recognize where we are with respect to self-government and how that relates to citizenship. Self-government agreements do provide real but limited autonomy. In practice, self-government has come about, though, through treaty and self-government agreements, not through court recognition yet. They do enable Indigenous peoples to adopt their own constitutions and their own laws in much less restrictive ways than the Indian Act, for example. But there are still limits that governments, provincial and federal, still impose on Indigenous peoples' freedom to govern under self-government agreements. I'll just highlight some of these limits and then focus on two of them. First of all, governments tend to not allow, it's not even on the table for negotiation, a number of jurisdictional aspects of governance, for example, criminal law or monetary policy. Some of these make sense, but some of them don't. Criminal law, for example, has been exercised as part of tribal sovereignty by American tribes for a long time. And you don't see any issues with how that power exercised by American tribal governance is a problem in the United States. Why would it be a problem in Canada? There's other things that are imposed, and this tends to reflect the requirement of certain Western ideas of what governance means. Accountability, publicity of laws, constitutional amendment processes. Some of these are not bad. Some of them are done, but may be done differently culturally, right? So there may be openness in terms of how you implement these that isn't going to necessarily be incompatible. But some of them might be. Two of them, I think, that are problematic is the fact that the governments and the courts try to ensure that certain fundamental rights of Indigenous individuals are respected. And what I mean by that is there are imposed limits on how self-government agreements are to define their citizenship. And there's this requirement, for example, that all Gwich'in, for example, are Canadian citizens and are entitled to all the rights and privileges of having been or being a Canadian citizen. But there might be problems with that. There might be problems with that. So first of all, let's see about control over membership and citizenship. As mentioned yesterday, Hayden, thanks Hayden, he pointed out that Indigenous peoples have their own customs for determining belonging, citizenship, to the family, the clan, the band, the confederacy, depending on the degree of social organization that's relevant. Then, of course, colonization happened and the sovereignty over self-determination and self-identification was severely interfered with. Indigenous governance was replaced with an imposed band council structure in many cases. And with respect to self-government agreements, generally government insists that the citizenship of a self-government agreement parallel, or at least minimally, include as citizens all those who are enrolled as land claim beneficiaries. And to some extent that makes sense. Under the land claim, people are enrolled as Gwich'in land claim beneficiaries. And so if you could have a self-government, it makes sense then that your core citizenship also reflect those who are enrolled as land claim beneficiaries. There's no ability, at least so far government hasn't allowed First Nations to limit their citizenship in terms of not including some beneficiaries. Now, with respect to the Gwich'in land claim, so you can probably imagine then that the core citizenship would be a person who is eligible to be a beneficiary as Gwich'in because of their ancestry, or somebody's been adopted into a Gwich'in family. So they need not be Gwich'in, but have been adopted into a Gwich'in family, or is Indigenous, but not Gwich'in, maybe a Inuvialuit, maybe Slavey, right? And has resided in the settlement area and has been accepted by the Gwich'in through an acceptance process. That's the enrollment process right now. And quite likely a citizenship, a Gwich'in citizenship would at least reflect that. So there are a couple of implications though. One of them is you can't be Gwich'in, you can't be a Gwich'in land claim beneficiary and not be a Gwich'in citizen of a Gwich'in government recognized under a self-government agreement. I was looking at and doing some research in preparation for today, and I noted that in a study, there was a study done of 737 tribal constitutions and membership codes in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. And apparently 57% made provision for enrollment of non-descendants, in other words, non-Gwich'in, for example, but most preferred Indigenous applicants. So you could be non-Gwich'in, but you'd have to be Indigenous. You could be Indigenous Slavey, you could be Indigenous Mohawk even, but you couldn't be non-Indigenous. Most, but there are some exceptions. So in one way, some make allowance for Indigenous, but not necessarily state Indigenous. In other words, in the United States, some tribes will recognize, for example, as Navajo citizens, maybe someone from Dene or someone from the Cree, right, as a citizen, right? Still Indigenous, but not state-defined Indigenous, right? Likewise, that's possible, arguably, to do so in Canada with respect to, say, Gwich'in citizens. Are we going to limit Gwich'in citizenship to just Canadian Indigenous and allow that imposed foreign boundary to define who can be a citizen? So there's some possibilities there. One of the things I want to keep in mind and reinforce is the importance between distinguishing citizenship from ethnic identity. It's really important, although we lose sight of that because of the way the federal government has defined Indians as on a racialized basis. For example, the decision of the Gwich'in people acting through its government in determining who is a citizen and what the legal relationship or rights of its citizens are to be to its government is an exercise of political and legal power. Now, this determination of citizenship is distinct from being ethnically Gwich'in based on ancestry. Ethnically Gwich'in is a genetic social fact. It's not a political fact, right? However, Gwich'in ancestry is obviously a significant marker for what could be exercised by government as a person who should be a citizen. So think about the fact that under the concept of self-government, under the concept of self-determination, determining your citizenship is a fundamental exercise of self-determination and an exercise of your nationhood status. Decide who should and should not be a citizen. Think about the fact that you don't necessarily even have to restrict your citizenship codes to Indigenous. Although it's not common among all those tribes' constitutions that were studied, there were a few that made it possible for a non-Indigenous person to become a citizen, let's say, of the Navajo Nation or the Pueblo, just for example. Non-Indigenous Gwich'in citizens, but need not be Gwich'in land claim beneficiaries, you understand? You could have someone who's a Gwich'in citizen, but not necessarily a land claim beneficiary. Right? Think about being a Canadian citizen. You do not have to be ethnically English, even though Canada is an English colony. Immigration allows for Koreans, for example, to become Canadian citizens. Including ethnic Koreans, however, is not likely to threaten Canadian cultural identity. At one time, it was government policy, though. For example, Asian immigrants were strictly controlled and limited because of the perceived threat to English values or Canadian values. But now Canadian society, based on English, Western European values, is so overwhelmingly dominant, there's no realistic threat to Canadian cultural integrity. However, the invitation of a non-Indigenous Canadian to be Gwich'in in the face of powerful assimilationist pressures, historical and present, is much more of a real threat to cultural integrity, and citizenship processes can reflect this risk by adding certain safeguards without necessarily becoming completely exclusionary. Some examples, for example, are requirements for knowledge of the culture and language of the First Nation. These requirements could be imposed in order for a non-Indigenous person to become a Gwich'in citizen. Right? Non-Indigenous Canadian person to become a Gwich'in citizen. It's possible, right? It's possible to tailor it. Now, what does the land claim agreement say? In the Gwich'in land claim agreement, there's a provision that states, nothing in this agreement shall affect the rights of the Gwich'in as Canadian citizens, and they shall continue to be entitled to all the rights and benefits of all other citizens, applicable to them from time to time. What does that mean? At first blush, you know, it doesn't look like this could be controversial, right? It doesn't look like it's threatening. But before I get into why it is threatening, I want to ask the back question. Oh, sorry, I didn't have that up there. There it is. I want to ask before I answer why that is a threatening provision, I want to ask the first question: how did the Gwich'in become Canadian citizens in the first place, if they are indeed recognized as a distinct people and nation without having first acquired Gwich'in consent to become absorbed into Canada as Canadian citizens? Canadian citizenship was not voluntary. It's not a voluntary choice for most Indigenous peoples in Canada. It was imposed. This is very colonial, not respectful of a nation-to-nation relationship. You know, Senator Charlie Watt made an important point yesterday when he said, the place where you start in your negotiations and the assumptions that are not tested or questioned really matter. Do you want to start from a position of disadvantage, or do you want to start from a position of sovereignty? Matters. Matters a lot. Now, going back to the significance of that limitation of being a Canadian citizen, the provision represents a potentially severe limitation on the Gwich'in right to construct their own membership rules, and determine their human boundaries, although within Indigenous societies, those boundaries often include the non-human, right, the natural environment, which is not something that's conceptually understood in Western definitions of citizenship. But it also includes the right to define the nature of that relationship between Gwich'in citizen and Gwich'in government, right? So the right to determine citizenship is more than saying you belong. It also gives the government the right to decide what your entitlements are and how you're going to relate to Gwich'in government. Now, this is important from a philosophical point of view, from a cultural point of view. From a Western society point of view, from a Canadian society point of view, rights of citizens, even the concept rights has a problem in translation, but just for the moment, the rights of citizens are usually framed in a Western democracy like Canada as freedoms and protections against government arbitrary power. And because of this, they're often equated with the idea of fundamental and inalienable human rights that are not to be arbitrarily diminished by the government. Now, this implies a certain conceptual understanding of how the individual is understood to be in relation with their collective, with the government of his or her people, which may not be compatible with traditional indigenous understandings of collective individual relations. May not be at all. Think about in Dene culture traditionally, going back to a Dene camp, for example, on the land. And let's say there was an individual in that camp who refused to comply with the wishes of the leadership based on the idea that he or she has a right not to comply, as it is contrary to his or her individual human right. Or are the interests of the individual and the collective in such a Dene historical context so interdependent as to be virtually inseparable, right? Think about that. From a Canadian perspective, could a government force a person to share their food with a neighbor, even if doing so would mean that the neighbor's own food security was infringed? Right? What would that neighbor say? He would grab the Charter of Rights. That neighbor would say, that infringes my Charter of Right to liberty, life, and security of the person. That kind of rule. After all, capitalism values individual property acquisition above all other values. The whole purpose of Western rights is to allow individuals to acquire and accumulate wealth without restriction. Right? That's the whole purpose of the Charter. Now this is potentially incompatible with any ways of the importance of sharing. Right? It reminds me of a Dene legend. Are you familiar with Julia Blondin's Greedy Girl story? It's a fairly long story. I'll just recap it briefly. One day there was a Dene family who visited another community on this lake. According to tradition, they're welcomed into the community, right? They're welcomed into the community. Talk about citizenship, they become part of that community. They're Dene. They may not be from the same community, but they become welcomed. Now, within that community, there was a girl who was extremely greedy. She ate everything. She ate constantly all the food, right? To the point where the community and the wife of the chief started complaining, saying this girl is starting to threaten our very survival as a community because she's so greedy. The chief had to constantly remind the community and his wife that we can't kick her out. We can't push her out. We have to continue to accept her presence, despite the fact that in doing so, our own survival is increasingly in jeopardy. It just goes to show later, though, that an enemy encampment was surrounding that community. That girl used her medicine power and destroyed the enemies. Right? That girl used her medicine power and destroyed the enemies. So there's several normative principles in that story, and I just highlighted it very briefly. One of them is about sharing, right? And the degree to how that is so important traditionally, and how valued that is. Now, you think that's compatible with a Western version of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that supports unlimited acquisition of individual wealth and no obligation to share it? No, not at all. Not at all compatible. So I get into some kind of legal stuff here. I don't want to necessarily bore you with it. But Canada does insist that the Charter apply in these self-government agreements, right? It almost invariably will insist that if you want a self-government agreement in this country, you're going to have to make sure that the Charter applies. But it's not at all certain under the Constitution whether the Charter would apply, even unless you agree that it applies in your self-government agreement. But if you don't, it's not at all clear that it would apply without that consent that it apply. And there's a number of arguments that explain why this may be the case. One of them is Section 32 of the Constitution, which says that the Charter only applies to the provincial and federal government, with no mention of Indigenous governments. So there's an argument there on a very structural reading of the Constitution. But there are other arguments with respect to the Charter itself. But it would be dependent on finding that the courts or an acknowledgement by government that the right to determine citizenship is in itself an Aboriginal right protected by Section 35. Because if that's the case, Section 25 of the Charter will say that the Charter can't abrogate or derogate from that right. Section 25 says that. So somebody wants to say, oh, you're discriminatory against me. The First Nation can say, well, Section 25 says, because this is an Aboriginal right and we can decide our own citizenship, the Charter doesn't apply to you. It doesn't allow you to infringe on our Aboriginal right. It's not at all clear, though, from a constitutional law point of view, whether the courts would go along with that argument. There's no court cases yet that have dealt with it in any significant way. So you have something, if you don't want the Charter to apply, or you want the Charter to apply in a way that's more tailored to your cultural values, you have some negotiating authority to stand on. In fact, the Labrador Inuit Agreement has done that to some extent by allowing in their agreement the right to create their own charter. Although there are limitations imposed and it can't conflict with the actual charter. But to the extent there's discretion, the Inuit charter can prevail. Now, government says, okay, you can have your right to determine citizenship, but these are the limitations we're going to impose on you. Can government do that? Can the Canadian government do that? Can the provincial governments do that? Under international law, they can't. Under the UN Declaration, for example, Article 33, Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own identity and membership in accordance with their customs and traditions, period. No limitations imposed there. It is interesting, though, that in an earlier draft, before this became approved by the UN General Assembly, it used to say Indigenous peoples have the right to determine their own citizenship, but it was replaced by identity and membership. I'm not sure why. I kind of can speculate why. But, government wants to limit what Indigenous peoples can do in terms of their freedom to govern. They don't want to see their sovereignty threatened by Indigenous sovereignty. So they try to limit concepts like citizenship. But it can mean the same thing. So importantly, the right is not qualified. The boundaries of who is or is not a Gwich'in member is completely up to the Gwich'in, according to international human rights, as understood and defined in the Declaration. The same is true in the OAS process that's ongoing right now, in terms of their development of an international human rights instrument for Indigenous peoples. It's a little bit more involved, though. It says Indigenous peoples and communities have the right to belong to one or more Indigenous peoples in accordance with their identity, traditions, customs, and systems of belonging. This provision explicitly recognizes the right of First Nations to allow for dual citizenship, right? So with this provision, it would be consistent with international Indigenous or developing Indigenous human rights in this case, for a Gwich'in citizen to also have inuvialuit citizenship. So it's possible under international Indigenous human rights standards. But this, of course, depends on the reciprocity between Indigenous nations, however, and it's critical to dual citizenship recognition. But it's up to the Indigenous nations to decide amongst themselves to the extent they want to recognize dual citizenship amongst themselves. Right now, federal government tends to restrict that as an option. Right? Most land claims agreements do not allow for dual enrollment as beneficiaries. However, enrollment to benefit from the land claim is different from citizenship determination of a constituted government, right? So the inuvialuit citizen who lives in Gwich'in territory and is also a Gwich'in citizen doesn't have to be a beneficiary of the Gwich'in land claim, right? Doesn't have to be. Citizenship is very distinct from benefits under land claims or ancestry. It's a political statement made by your political government. So I want to conclude here with a couple of points. The federal, provincial, and territorial governments in Canada need to understand that the jurisdiction to determine citizen boundaries of Indigenous peoples is a fundamental collective right that belongs to such people. And any interference in that right is a breach and a violation of that fundamental human right. Indigenous negotiators need to make sure that when Canada wants to include a limit on this freedom to determine membership, they are in violation of the minimum human rights standards that the state must adhere to. To allow such interference is to essentially waive your international human rights as a people. This is a drastic concession and a sacrifice on behalf of an Indigenous people if they must forego it in order to secure a treaty agreement. In other words, Canadian citizenship is not a gift necessarily in this context. It's actually a wolf in sheep's clothes. Imposing Canadian citizenship as defined by a Western philosophy and values paradigm is deeply colonial and assimilationist. And so there is a lot that you give up, potentially, if you agree to that provision I mentioned about Gwich'in becoming Canadian citizens. Right? That's not to say that in negotiations you can't work out a relationship that allows Gwich'in citizenship to trump Canadian citizenship in certain circumstances. There's no reason why you can't work out when certain aspects of Canadian citizenship will prevail over Gwich'in aspects of Canadian citizenship, right? I mean, it's useful to have the Canadian passport until you get a Gwich'in passport, right? But that's not even on the table for negotiations, according to the federal government. Yesterday, just as a quick aside, I got this email from a friend about this Indigenous Australian. Have you heard about him? Who has declared sovereignty within Australia over a certain territory of his tribe and people, and that he has renounced his Australian citizenship to the point where he's given up his right to a pension, where he's given up his license, his birth certificate, everything, and now he's doing that in his tribal name, in his tribal, according to his tribal authority. Right? So he issues his own license plate, he issues his own driver's license, and he issues birth certificates. Right? And authorities, Australian authorities, including 2 schools, have accepted that documentation. Right? So sometimes it's just a matter of doing it. He's my new hero, by the way. I'll end there. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know it's a lot to cover, a lot of legal stuff too.
Thank you very much, Larry. We do have time for questions. Again, I just ask you to move to the microphones this morning so that you are captured on audio. Yeah.
Hello, hi. Thank you for your presentation. Do you know the Indigenous Australian's name, just so I can write it down?
It's on my. Just a sec.
Okay, no rush.
It's on my first page. Right
no
away.
rush. It's funny because yesterday that thought came to my mind about because of the conflicts of self-government, Section 35, everything that you've kind of put out before us. And yesterday I had this thought. I was like, well, can I just be my own, or can I claim sovereignty? So that example is great. And I was just hoping you could maybe, if you can, delve into more of the Section 25.
Yeah, sure. When Section 35, the one that's generally mostly well known, that states that existing Aboriginal treaty rights are hereby recognized and affirmed, when that was put into the Constitution, there was a concern, though, that if that meant special rights or unique rights that were only applicable to Aboriginal peoples, that at some points a non-Aboriginal person might challenge that right, and under Section 15 of the Charter, which says everybody's equal and you can't discriminate based on race, ethnicity, etc., right? So somebody could say, well, I should get that benefit, and it's discriminatory based on race or ethnicity to not receive that benefit. And so the Section 25 was put in there to make sure that nobody could use the Charter to defeat an Aboriginal right recognized in the Constitution, right? Section 25 actually even goes a little further, and this is not generally well known. It doesn't mean just Aboriginal treaty rights in Section 35. It also means other rights, so they can even be non-constitutional rights that will trump someone who's trying to argue discrimination. So something to think about. I've actually tried to argue it in terms of Section 718 of the Criminal Code, where a non-Aboriginal person tried to argue that why should Aboriginal people get the benefit of judicial sentencing under that section and a non-Aboriginal person, right? So you can argue that's actually another right protected by Section 25.
Thank you very much for raising some of the Western philosophical assumptions that go into constituting identity, membership, and citizenship. In your conclusion, you mentioned that the right to determine citizenship is a fundamental collective right. collective and collectively have been called the smudgiest words in the English language. So I share your concerns about a system that is founded primarily on a capitalist, possessive, individual system. But in terms of seeking help for the articulation of collective rights, where do you think we should look?
In terms of its potential conflict with Western understandings of what should be incorporated in those collectives?
Well, just in terms of the very standing of collective rights
Right.
in relationship to individuals.
Oh, yeah. That's a very complex question, and I'm still working on it myself. All I know is that it's not necessarily. Sometimes people will think that a collective right is automatically in conflict with an individual right, and they're not necessarily in conflict. They can be, but they don't necessarily have to conflict. Indigenous societies, I mean, a lot of people think that there wasn't much freedom. It was all the collective that determines how every movement you make is determined by custom or whatever. Indigenous societies were actually extremely free in terms of what an individual could do, right? Kinship obligations required certain actions at certain points in time. But I would argue that traditional societies were much more free than we are today. I mean, I can't even drive on the freeway over 100. I'd like to drive 110. I do. But I mean, that's kind of putting it a little silly, but yeah, I'd have to have another coffee to really get into that.
This is just, it's not really a question, it's more of an illustration of what you're speaking about. I had a call from a person who's registered as a status Indian, and I don't think he has a problem with, being registered under this particular band, but he has several children, I think 5, he said, but his wife is Inuk, and so he wanted to, his children got registered under his band, so they have status under his band, but he wanted to have their status removed and to be taken out of that band so they could be a beneficiary of the Nunavut land claim. But the registrar has no authority to remove somebody from a band. So that becomes a problem. There's no mechanism in the Act to enable the registrar to do that, even if one were to agree with his point. That's where things stand for him today.
Is it with respect to removing themselves as a band member, or removing status as a status?
Well, those are two different possibilities.
Yeah.
And I said you have to find out what the requirements are under the land claim in order to be a beneficiary, and I didn't have all the information about that. So,
because in one way, in one situation, it might be possible, in another, it might not be. I mean, there is no mechanism to, once you become status, you can't not become status.
Exactly.
There's no mechanism for that.
And some people have asked to do it to be able to join an American band if a Canadian status Indian marries somebody in the States. In both of these instances, the people who were asking the questions ended up saying, well, I'll just drop it for now. And I guess in the case in Washington State, I think the band in Washington State decided to overlook the fact that the woman was a Canadian status Indian and just included her anyway. Mm-hmm. And the father of the children with the Inuk woman decided that he would just leave it till they were adults or something like that. So, there was no way he could proceed. He was just asking a question. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that does illustrate to some extent the implications of the imposed Indian Act status system of defining Indians and having that also become analogous to a marker of identity. when they should be separately thought of, right? They're not. Status doesn't mean you're Gwich'in or mate, or no, it doesn't come from Métis, but doesn't mean that. And that was talked about yesterday a bit, and how people sometimes internalize that status as equating that with identity, when in fact it has nothing to do with identity or citizenship. It has all to do with government control over how they can govern a certain population for their benefit. I mean, that's what the Indian Act is all about. Yeah, I mean, it does have some benefits, but it comes with a high cost.
I'm actually going to ask you a question. I've mostly been doing organizational stuff, but I'm very interested in the presentation you gave. And at first I'd like to make a comment organizationally. So it would be terrific to hear from some of the Gwich'in youth on this topic, because you're at an age where identity is very important. You're figuring out who you are, really who you are in the world. And Larry's presentation was quite challenging in that regard. And I don't think I agree with you about a couple of things I want to say. But I hope out of that little difference of opinion there might be between us, that some of the younger people would weigh in on this conversation. Don't be shy about the technical terms. We won't care if you don't quite use the words right, but we'll understand what you're talking about. The issues are, everybody understands what the issues are, the difference between who you are as a person, your identity, and how the government sees you. That's something we all understand. Larry, this is really challenging for me, your presentation, because all this time I've been thinking about modern treaties, land claim agreements and self-government agreements, as a way of negotiating consent. The moment at which the Indigenous authorities or the Indigenous group of people who are accepting an agreement consent to Canada, consent to being part of Canada. Yeah. And for me, that's a very important principle of the treaties, that the two parties freely consent to form a partnership. But the gist of your presentation is going in the other direction. You're saying it's a trap, basically. So, am I right in extending what you said to make that point?
I don't think that's unfair characterization of what I'm trying to say. I mean, it is a trap in the sense that there are limitations of what can be put on the table for consent. And so are you really then starting from two equal positions of power and authority? You're already disadvantaged in what you can consent to. So it's a trap in that way, but it's also a trap sometimes in how government imposes a Western model of governance and won't accept Indigenous models of governance. Maybe it's just a matter of time, education. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission might help us educate governments in terms of values and philosophies and principles that are Indigenous, so that they understand and they're not afraid, and so they don't feel like they have to impose their system. Right now, the dominant understanding of the courts, and I would say most government officials, is that if you take away Canadian law, there is a void, right? There's no law. That's the assumption that's being made right now. But we know as Indigenous that that's not true. There's no void there. It's just, it can actually be fulfilled now with Indigenous law and customs and traditions. And that can govern. But Canadian negotiators aren't there yet. And so there is more of an imposition than there is a true equality. I don't think we have to continue with that inequality. I think we need that education. That Truth and Reconciliation Commission and those calls to action are really important, I think, for that.
Thank you.
I got a question. We're talking about rights, Declaration of Rights. I'm just thinking on the other side of the spectrum, like, is there a declaration of wrongs? As in, like, if we were to make something going on in regards to rights, would we then be able to put beside it things like about our environment that's wrong, and things about what have happened in the past that are wrong, and put that in the same declaration alongside our rights? Yeah. Or is that something that's not, is that not the way?
No, I think you hit the head on the nail, or the nail on the head, in terms of how Western governments think about defining fundamental relations as rights, as opposed to responsibilities, or as opposed to relation, right? And so if you harm your relation, you're committing a wrong. And there's no reason why that philosophical understanding can't inform a First Nation constitution. There's nothing that says it can't. We have to keep in mind that we're also not static, even though the courts say our rights can only be those that were pre-contact. Societies evolve, and we adopt, and we say, okay, they got a good idea, let's adopt it. So when I say Indigenous traditions and governance, I don't mean pre-contact, I mean self-determined. And so whatever the community wants, I say yes.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. You perhaps just answered my question, but I was just wanting to reflect a little bit on how Inuit fit into this presentation. The president of ITK, Nathan Obed, recently asked the Prime Minister not to say nation to nation when referring to Inuit, but to say Inuit to Crown, because they see themselves as first Canadians and Canadians first. And so when talking about how in the Labrador Inuit have their own charter, and I'm just wondering if you see a conflict there between Inuit identifying as Canadian rather than a separate nation.
So you're thinking of the Labrador in particular, or the Nunavut?
Or Inuit in general.
Inuit in general.
Yeah.
I think the same principles generally apply, although with Nunavut, their land claim agreement agreed that they would create an independent territory, which is by definition fundamentally Canadian citizenship. Doesn't have anything to do with Inuit citizenship or the authority of Inuit to determine citizenship. It's purely Canadian citizenship. That's not to say someday that might change, but as a territory within the Federation of Canada, that there is no nation-to-nation relationship. So that's maybe where he's coming from. You can't talk about Inuit citizenship in Nunavut because all you can talk about is Canadian citizenship because of the way that they agreed. Now that means, though, they control the governance of Nunavut and determine how to govern the state because they have the most population. But the Métis thought that in 1870, and we're regretting that ever since. And when we decided to form a public government in Manitoba, we got overwhelmed by settlers pretty darn quick. So we lost control.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We've got 2 people who have questions.
Sego Guego, Lohetiodum got Philip Whitecree from Akwesasne. And it's interesting because it's Akwesasne is Mohawk community. It's connected to the Haudenosaunee and has to deal with an American elective system, a Canadian elective system, as well as traditional government in the community. So everything you raised is exactly what, as a community, we've been dealing with as we are going forward on the Canadian side through a self-government agreement. And one, we did recognize that first issue of declaring the rights and citizenship via in and out of Canada, because as our community is split by the border, we had to become very, very creative as how do we acknowledge the members that are born on the other side of the border and make sure that they are considered part of the community as one. So that has been something that as a community we've had to very, very strongly defend, as our community itself actually predates both predates Canada and the US, and so having to deal with the aftermath afterwards, especially with the border. So I congratulate you from bringing up those issues, because it is the same issues that we're having at a fundamental level, but what we were raising is that we're looking at as the self-government agreement is for the community, and it would not affect the Mohawk Nation rights. So therefore, we're giving some latitude of protection to the traditional government, as well as allowing other Mohawk communities to be able to go in through their own self-government agreement, but making sure that they know that it is not to affect the overall collective rights. It's only affecting the community collective rights to a point. So that's, thanks again for that. And I'm sure if anyone else wants any conversation about that, I can touch on the complexities. And I understand from your point of view how complex these discussions about rights and how one wants to identify themselves can go. So, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And it's difficult when you have that border, because the issue of Canadian sovereignty becomes a significant question. And Canada controls immigration, and they don't want to see any loss of authority over immigration by an Indigenous government doing something that's contrary to immigration policy. That's one of the things that's not on the negotiating table in self-government agreements. So I commend the work you're doing. It's not easy, that's for sure. I just want to point out the study that I mentioned about 737 tribal constitutions. It was in Kirsty Gover's article there. It's in a fairly recent publication, if you're interested. But I can send everybody my PowerPoint, and that's my email if you want.
I really appreciate the presentation, but I have a question in terms of the Yukon self-government agreements. They've been granted the authority to create tribal courts. How do you see that moving forward, given that I don't think that the state is willing to give up a lot of the laws that I think that our Indigenous communities would like to take over? Yeah.
You might be pointing out an incompatibility that doesn't necessarily exist. With the Yukon, the same thing exists in the Nisga'a self-government agreement as well. Nisga'a can establish their own Nisga'a courts. They haven't identified that as a priority in terms of their issues. But they have the power to do that if they want. That deals with the administration of justice, the setting up of the courts, the hiring of the judges, the process issues. They still have to apply Canadian criminal law, though, and even provincial law, probably. I'd have to double check. But they have their own control of the court system itself. And some people kind of criticize that. Well, it doesn't include your ability to define your own criminal law. But having your own court system and the discretion that goes with that is quite significant. Again, though, it is a Western model of a court. The adversarial process is not based on traditional dispute resolution processes or circle healing processes. And so there is, it's just another example of that that imposition in order to get a treaty. Maybe the Gwich'in have the better idea and just assert your title and the hell with negotiating with the Crown.
But even with that, the underlying interest in the land.
I know. Don't get me on that.
Well, on behalf of everyone, I'd like to thank you, Larry, for a very insightful presentation that I'm sure will leave people thinking beyond this morning. On behalf of everyone, a very small token of gratitude.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that people will be happy to get in touch with you about your presentation. So is it lchartrand@uottawa.ca?
El Chartrand, yeah, without the ND.
Oh, you've been cut off, have you? Thank you very much.